So how do we plan with literacy in mind? Well, we have to start first with content. And when planning a unit, one way to start is with essential questions for student learning. What are students learning? Why are they learning it? And what is the enduring takeaway that we want them to walk away from a unit of instruction with? This helps us to think about what assessments can measure student progress towards these goals or towards these essential questions. We then move to specific content and content objectives or instructional goals for each lesson. The framing question for these content objectives that are at the lesson level is what information is being taught and what is most crucial for students to learn. So if students have to focus on one part of the material, what do we really want them to walk away with in any lesson that we're teaching? How does what students are learning align to the standards, and how does it align to the overall unit? Content objectives really refer to the specific content knowledge with which we want students to walk away from the course or the session with. So we teach a lot of things, but what is it that students should really focus on? What's the most important information? And how should they be thinking about that information when they're approaching a lesson or a lecture? So some guidelines for content objectives, and these will be important to keep in mind when we do some activities around designing content objectives. So you'll probably want to pull up these slides when we begin planning objectives in class. So one of the things about content objectives is that they're written in terms of what students will learn or be able to do in relation to the subject matter. And it's important that that learning be active, right? So you don't want a passive verb students will understand. You want them to be able to demonstrate their understanding. So there's a difference between understanding, which is hard to measure, and demonstrating understanding. And you can talk about how they would demonstrate that understanding. Content objectives should be stated simply, both orally and in writing, and shared with students, then reviewed at the end of the session. Content objectives should also be tied or aligned to grade level content standards. One of the things that I've noticed as I supervise student teachers is that often they'll have objectives, and those objectives will look like agenda items, which we'll talk about in a couple bullet points. But I really push them to align their objectives to the grade level content standards, because you really want your content objectives to reflect the standards that you want students to be progressing towards. The content objective should be specific and realizable within the span of a single lesson or whatever measure of time. So if you have unit content objectives, you're really thinking about the key concepts overall in a whole unit. If you're thinking lesson content objectives, you really want to think what is actually possible for students to learn, realizable and measurable within that particular lesson. And as I mentioned before, content objectives are not your agenda or list of activities. So it's not like students will listen to a PowerPoint on content objectives is your content objective, because listening to the PowerPoint is something that you want them to do, but it's not really what you want them to walk away with. What you want them to walk away with is students will be able to demonstrate an understanding of content objectives as demonstrated in their lesson planning, right? So you see the difference between listening to a lecture, which is more passive, and then actively demonstrating one's understanding. Finally, content objectives answer the question, what should students know or be able to do by the end of the lesson? And how will they demonstrate that knowledge or skill, just as I modeled for you a second ago? After we consider content, because obviously as secondary teachers, content is going to be really important in our lesson planning, we want to think about language objectives and processes. So we want to think about how we are going to convey the content that we are giving to students, right? So what are the ways in which language will be used, and how will academic language be developed? And this is really important as we think about moving students towards our final assessment, and as we think about who students are in terms of their humanity, their identity, and their language levels, right? We want to think about the ways in which we are demonstrating this content. Are we giving students multiple access points? Are we giving them opportunities to practice using language both orally and in and writing, and how are we supporting their academic language development. It's important to consider that language learning is a process and that language skills, interactive, receptive, and we're really thinking about interactive communication, receptive, so listening and reading, and then productive, so speaking, but speaking not necessarily in partners, which would be interactive, but speaking at length or writing. Language skills should be worked on concomitantly, even though receptive and interactive skills generally develop before productive skills. So even if a student isn't as strong in oral production of ideas or written production, it's really important that we give them opportunities to try and to continue to develop those skills, because we can't really gauge development if we're not sure where students are at any particular point in time. And that's why we use scaffolding or supports to help our students reach those goals. So some key components of language objectives similar to our content objectives. When we think about language objectives, they are written in terms of what students will do with language to support their language development and or their content understanding. So the language objectives are really written in terms of supporting language development and content. Again, they're simply stated, shared, reviewed, and language objectives should be limited. So we don't want to overwhelm language objectives, as we'll see in a second. We're really designed for English language learners, and we don't want to overwhelm our language learners by having them have to switch gears so many times. And so we really want to think about what do we want to develop with our language learners at any given lesson. They should be planned to meet the learning goals and prepare students for academic language needed or to understand content and perform the lesson activities. So when we think about moving towards our final assessment, what's academic language and the academic skills that students would need to meet those final assessment goals? What would they need to perform the lesson activities? And how can we help them, whether it's sentence frames, whether it is previewing the vocabulary, and we'll talk about that as we go into instruction. But what can we do to help them develop the academic language and language structures in order to move towards that final goal? They're often thought about in terms of reading, writing, speaking, and listening, the four components of language and literacy. And then some areas to think about, and this is developed more in the SIOP chapter on objectives, is academic vocabulary development, language skills and functions. So how do we actually use language for persuasion, for information? How can we use it interactively versus productively in a presentation, language structures and grammar. So that's when we're using sentence frames or paragraph frames, when we're looking at grammatical correctness, and then language learning strategies. So how can we help to develop language, particularly for our English language learners, but also in terms of academic language forms. Why are language objectives even important to consider? I know that you've probably covered content objectives in your various other courses, but why would we consider language objectives? Well, language objectives were designed specifically to help teachers focus on supporting students' academic language development, particularly for their English language. It's really important for us to keep in mind what we're doing linguistically in order to support students' language development. So how can we give students opportunities for speaking and listening and writing and thinking in English or in the target language if we're a world language teacher? For English language learner students and language learners in general, it's also important to think about functional, social, and interpersonal language development as well. So it's not just about the academic language of the classroom, but how can we support English language learners in interacting that will help them to feel more socially accepted within the classroom, and that can help them lower their affective filter, lower their stress level in terms of learning, because they're actually interacting in a socially accepted environment. And then language objectives, they really support the development of content knowledge and understanding as well as language development itself. So it's not just language for language use, it's language to support content. So we're thinking about the vocabulary, the language of your discipline, right? Or we're thinking about how students need to communicate if they were using their content knowledge in a professional setting, right? So we're really thinking about what language is necessary to support the learning that we really are looking towards in our final assessment and then also in our field. So why are language objectives important? Well, English language learners need opportunities to develop oral language proficiency as well as reading and writing skills. So they need those opportunities for practice. If we are not thinking about the opportunities to give students a chance to practice in their second language or in a language that they're not accustomed to, often we move on because we're not comfortable with that silence, or we just let them, especially if we speak their second language or their native language, sorry, if we speak their native language, we just want them to communicate their understanding. But it's really important that we work to help them develop their oral language proficiency and academic language skills in English. It's also important to attend to function and form in order to move English language learners towards full proficiency in college readiness. You'll hear a lot of college professors saying these kids just can't write, or I don't know how they made it into college or through high school because they just don't know how to write correctly. And I think there's a lot of function and attention played to, or sorry, there's a lot of attention paid to how clearly one can communicate the ideas and the content, but not as much in terms of the function and form. And that can actually act as a gatekeeper for many English language learners. And so we want to make sure that it's not just that we understand, but that we can actually support clarity and correctness. And the more exposure that students have to academic language and the more they use it, the faster they'll develop that language proficiency. So it's helpful for us to keep academic language in mind, because as they move forward from our classes and into the post-secondary level or into the career world, they're really going to need to know how to interact linguistically, and we can prepare them for that in the classroom. And finally, we can only assess progress towards mastery if we assess language objectives. So we can only really see how much our students are developing academic language or English in general if we are assessing language objectives and if we know how we're explicitly trying to develop language. So here is a list of some helpful verbs for objectives. This list is also in the SciOp book, but it's here. And again, this will be helpful when we move to our in-class lecture and you're able to pull up these references as we work on objectives. Where do we go from here? Well, really, objectives move us from assessment to our lesson preparation. So when we move beyond objectives in lesson preparation, we actually use our objectives to frame the lesson format, right? So you'll see that we'll move into lesson planning and talk about how we can use the structure of a lesson plan to help us think about how we're going to move towards objectives. Once you have your content and language objectives, you can begin designing activities that support your objectives using literacy scaffolds that support the language objectives and student learning. And language and literacy strategies can help support your content understanding and be part of your language objectives, of course. So that's the end of this part of lecture. I hope that through this session you were able to distinguish content and language objectives and determine why both are important to consider in planning lessons. You'll get more experience with that in class, and hopefully you will be able to identify at least one connection between assessment, objectives, lesson planning, and literacy in general. Thanks so much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in our